Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 3 in the Civil Rights lecture series. And tonight, whenever you're watching this, we're going to be talking about the experiences of African Americans in particular, but minorities more generally in the post-Civil War America. So in our last lecture series, we talked about the challenges that African Americans faced after the Civil War. That sort of question of, well, didn't we fix all this? Isn't that what the Civil War was for? But of course, as we found out, the fix was not quite that easy. And it was really an institutional and emotional change that a lot of Americans had to go through before the Civil Rights Movement could really take hold. So the information that you're going to hear in this lecture is really about what were conditions like for people living not only in the South, but in all parts of the United States after the Civil War, and what did those conditions create for the minorities, and specifically African Americans who were living under them. So the slide you're looking at right now, the title of it is The Jim Crow South. And Jim Crow is a term that refers to a period of time in American history in which laws and rules which drastically segregated American society were put into place. Students have asked me in the past, who was Jim Crow? And when people talk about Jim Crow, they're generally talking not about a person, they're talking about an idea. When people talk about Jim Crow, they talk about this really brutal, segregationist idea. And I think I did some research a couple of years ago, and I think Jim Crow was like a cartoon character that sort of emerged into this idea, this emblem, so to speak, of segregationist policies. So people referring to Jim Crow, when they refer to it, that's what they're talking about. Well, Jim Crow and the Jim Crow South existed as a way for whites to continue their domination of African Americans after the Civil War. After Reconstruction, the brutality of different groups, including the KKK, and other white segregationist organizations and terrorist organizations, those organizations brutalized African Americans. But not only that, but within the structures of power in the legal system in the United States too, there were policies and practices that led to this segregationist society. So Jim Crow laws were written as laws that created strict separation between blacks and whites in virtually all aspects of society. Segregation, essentially what it means is it's a separation. When you segregate one from the other, you're separating. When we're talking about segregation in this context, we're talking about segregation based upon race. But you can have segregation based upon gender, you could have segregation based upon baseball team liking or disliking. I mean, there's lots of ways you can separate people, of course. But in the South, as well as in the North, after the Civil War, segregation was based on race. And essentially what race meant was non-whites. If you were a Native American, if you were Creole, so someone who had mixed heritage with French and African American heritage, if you were someone who was Asian American, Latino, all of the same segregationist policies tended to be associated with you that were associated with African Americans. So that's where we get this sort of the discussion or the phrase colored. Non-whites were segregated from whites. And a lot of this was based on this thinking that emerged within the white community about the dangers posed by African Americans. And that's something we're going to talk about in this lecture series as well. The Jim Crow laws were laws that were passed by white Southerners as well as people in the North. I want to just be really clear, even though this slide says the Jim Crow South, many of these segregationist policies did still apply in the North. However, they always were more prevalent in the South than they were in the North. And one of the most obvious and probably most famous examples is being shown here in the picture of these drinking fountains, this iconic image of the white versus colored drinking fountain. The notion that white people and black people could not or should not share a drinking fountain because of this need to separate the races is probably no more obvious than it is in this particular image. And there are lots of images like this. But so too were these segregationist policies, these Jim Crow laws passed in cases of marriage. So whites and blacks were prohibited from marrying one another. It wasn't going to be until the late 1960s when that policy was overturned. Firearms. Blacks in many places were not allowed to own guns. Imagine that. I mean, especially in a state like the one that we live in, and people are so passionate about the gun laws and the gun rights that they have. African Americans were simply not allowed. Based on these Jim Crow, these racist segregationist laws, were not allowed to own guns. And not only that, but blacks were also required to submit to things like curfews. So had to be in at a certain time of night. But segregation was also seen in housing, in employment, schools, public transportation, restaurants, movie theaters, baseball stadiums, etc., etc. And it was some of these practices are the ones that are the most famous, but also are the ones that are most misunderstood. A lot of times people will say, well, you know, who cares if you have two separate schools, one for blacks, one for whites, as long as they're the same. And that notion of separation and whether or not is fair to have separation would be challenged by the courts. And we'll talk about those court cases in the next lecture series. Images such as this one, For Rent to Colored, are among the famous images also that really speak to this segregationist experience of African Americans at this time. But also in schools. This is a photograph of a teacher standing at the back of a schoolroom for black children. One of the things that will later be challenged by the courts, in particular in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, is can a society have separate facilities and maintain facilities that are equal? In a practical sense, when looking at the segregation of the South after the Civil War, it was absolutely not equal. This black school, you can see, is, filthy. It has a wood-burning stove or coal-burning stove. The children are using desks from the 1800s. In most cases, teachers were paid much, much less in black schools. Black schools got the leftover books, leftover materials of the white schools, and the system was really not a fair system. But even places that you might be surprised had segregation. In this picture, you can see from Selma, Alabama, a sign saying public swimming pool, white only. So the message, of course, being that the white kids wouldn't want to swim with the black kids because they perhaps carried disease, they were dirty, and these were real beliefs. White people believed that black people carried more disease, they were less trustworthy, they were dirty. These kinds of awful stereotypes and really kind of cruel cultural concepts dominated the thinking in many places in the United States. You could go to public beaches in parts of New Jersey and New York, and they also had segregationist signs saying this beach for white only. In the North, however, instead of it being an issue often of segregation of whites and blacks, the issue often became between Jews and non-Jews. And so it wasn't just blacks who were being discriminated against, but there were all kinds of minorities, like Jews, who were also suffering the same kinds of discrimination. If you went to the Southwest, it would be signs like this one. We serve whites only, no Mexicans or Spanish. And so, again, it's important to remember that this is not an issue just of black and white, that segregation affected vast numbers of people. So how did Americans get these ideas? Where was it perpetuated that we had some of these sort of stereotypes? How were they perpetuated? There were lots of notions within popular culture that supported these racist images. And people in film, on radio, people had these ideas of kind of the oaf, the black oaf, or in the case of Amos and Andy being a radio production that later became, it was a cartoon series that became a radio production and later was turned into a short-lived television production as well, where you had these sort of buffoon black men. But keep in mind, looking at this image, these are not black men. These are white men in what was called and is still called blackface, with these extreme, and oftentimes using shoe polish, black shoe polish on their faces, and painting these like sort of grotesque white lips to represent this sort of racist image of what black people looked like. A really famous singer, the famous singer Al Jolson, who's pictured here on this screen, became very famous for singing jazz music or black music in blackface. And he was one of the most popular performers in the 1920s, and he performed like this with this black face. But even on television and in films, we saw images of black people that were extremely racist and led to supporting these racist notions. The program, the show The Little Rascals, you guys might be familiar with it from the more modern film series of The Little Rascals. But The Little Rascals was a television program which later became, or also was some film clips that they showed in movie theaters of a group of white children and their one black friend, Buckwheat. And it should not be forgotten that Buckwheat did not speak in the Little Rascals films except to say a few taglines that were very poorly. I mean, he would say things like "ote" instead of "okay." He had this sort of ignorant manner of speech. He also was often dirty. His hair was always messed up, and he became kind of a joke character, so to speak. And so, again, you can sort of see these really racist images projected from film, radio, and other kinds of theatrical productions. But probably no more racist images can be seen than in the film, and one of the most famous films of all time, a film called Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation was made in 1915 by a man named D.W. Griffith. And the film was a retelling of the post-Civil War era with this imagination that what if blacks took over the government? What if blacks took over America? And it is this dramatic film that portrays blacks as flesh-thirsty. And when I say flesh, I mean the flesh of white women they were thirsty for. This was a belief that some white people had, that black men would, if given the chance, would rape your white women. It was a belief that, in particular, many Southerners had. This idea that they needed to save their white women, that they needed to protect them from this scourge of black men. This becomes a justification for many, many lynchings, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. I want you guys to actually take a look at this image. This is an image from the film Birth of a Nation. And in the film Birth of a Nation, not only are African Americans portrayed as thirsting after the flesh of white women, but they are also portrayed, along with them are portrayed the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is portrayed as literally the heroes of the film. In this film, Birth of a Nation, which was one of the very first sort of great epic films that was produced and was seen by many people in theaters all over the United States, the Ku Klux Klan are the ones that rescue America from the scourge of the black man. And in this film, we see a white man dressed in blackface portraying a black man who, in the scene just prior to this, had actually been chasing after a white woman, a white Southern woman who in this film chooses to throw herself off a cliff rather than be pursued by this black man. The images are horrifying. And it was taken very seriously. People took this film seriously. D.W. Griffith, when he produced the film, believed these ideas and perpetuated these really horrific stereotypes that were at that time in some parts of the country, popular ideas. On the webpage that I have for you guys, I have 2 clips posted, and I want you to watch both of those clips. I think they're both under 10 minutes. In the second clip in particular, I want you to take a look at that one, and you can pause this lecture here in just a couple of minutes, because one of the most shocking scenes for me is a scene in which D.W. Griffith actually plays out what would Congress look like if black people were in charge. And the images are of black men drinking alcohol in Congress. They literally have briefcases filled with fried chicken and watermelon, some of the most horrifying racist notions. They put their dirty feet up on the tables, and up in the gallery of Congress, we have a group of white people looking down, shaking their heads in the sadness of what has happened to America now that the black people have taken over. And because of what we discussed in the last lecture about these horrible ideas about, or rather the lack of representation of black people in Congress, it makes me doubly sort of horrified to consider these images, knowing that we have only ever elected 6 black men to Congress or to the U.S. Senate. And these kinds of ideas about black men and their danger, so to speak, are part of the reason why people, especially in the early part of the 20th century, had these notions and these fears about black people entering politics. So why don't you pause this now and watch those clips of Birth of a Nation. I want to talk next specifically about this organization, the KKK, and you also have a film clip that I'm going to post for you to watch about the history of the KKK. And this organization, probably more than any other white supremacist organization, has gotten quite a bit of attention, in part because they really are sort of a dramatic and shocking example of these kinds of racist organizations and racist ideas that existed and to a certain extent still exist in many places in the United States. The high point of the membership of the KKK took place during the 1920s and 30s. And the federal government did very little to dismantle this organization, despite the fact that black people's civil rights were being consistently violated. People were being murdered by this organization. Entire counties were run, entire court systems were controlled by members of the KKK. Still, the federal government only intervened one time prior to the 1960s. It was going to be until the mid-1960s before the federal government would intervene to actually arrest and take in hand the violent terrorist activities of the KKK. And the only president to do this, other than President Kennedy with his brother Bobby Kennedy as the Attorney General, the only president prior to them that did intervene was President Grant. So we're talking about a 19th century president. In the entire 20th century, it took until John Kennedy for the federal government to intervene and defend African Americans against this homegrown terrorist organization. The other thing that's going to come up in the film that you're going to watch is the people who joined the KKK typically were poor whites. And that's kind of an interesting thing to consider. It was often people who were downtrodden who were joining this KKK, this Knights of the Ku Klux Klan organization, as an attempt to elevate themselves. Their fear of being dominated by or potentially being passed up economically or politically by African Americans was a really powerful fear. And so the KKK actually courted poor whites to join this organization and use terrorist activities to intimidate and in many cases kill blacks. And in this image you can see this is actually a photograph taken in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. This is a photo taken in full view. People often think the KKK always hid their faces. As a matter of fact, the hiding of your face was really only a modern tactic of the KKK. People could openly be members of the KKK and participate in some of the most brutal behavior of the KKK, all the way up through and into the 1960s because there was no consequence for it. And so in this case, you see a march on Washington, D.C. with hundreds of members of white-clad KKK members marching on the Capitol. As a matter of fact, as you'll see in the film, American presidents were members of the KKK. This was an organization that was accepted and in some quarters was considered a really well-respected organization. So we have to really be clear about that because this was not a fringe organization. This was not a few crazy people. This was a very powerful and an organization that had support from the highest levels of government. And what did this organization do? Among other things, you know, they burned homes, they intimidated, they controlled courthouses, controlled government, controlled police stations. But some of the most brutal and horrific acts were the lynchings. And lynchings are murder or a violent act committed by a mob. And the KKK regularly, between the years, as this graph shows you, between the years of 1882 and 1968, practiced lynchings throughout the United States, but primarily in the South. And this chart gives you a sense of the kinds of things that they did. Just a horrible thing. I'm going to show you a picture next, and I want you to brace for the next two shots because they are really shocking and horrifying to look at. But as you look at these next two pictures, I want you to look very closely, especially at this next one. And what I want you to do is I want you to look in particular at the faces of the people in the crowd, as well as the condition of the men who are who've been victimized in these images. This is a photograph taken of a black man who was lynched. You can tell in part by the way that the people are dressed. This was in the 1920s. He was hung. Lynchings weren't always hangings. That's kind of the most famous, what we tend to think of when we think of lynchings, but lynchings also involved people being shot, being beaten to death, people being burned alive. The thing I want you to look at really closely here, though, is I want you to look at this man's wrists. Because what you see on his wrists are handcuffs. And what that means is that there were police involved at some stage of this lynching. And for me, that, aside from these sort of smiling faces and the crowd gathering to see this horrific sight, it's knowing that there were law enforcement that allowed this to happen. That is the thing that chills me. The next image is, again, a crowd forming. It's from the 1920s. That's when many lynchings were at their height. And we don't know who this man was. We don't know what his crime was. But I can tell you that this picture actually became a postcard. And it was sent by people around the country as a sort of celebration, a way of celebrating, you know, white pride, of taking care of the black problem. Again, just a horrifying legacy that our country really has to live with. So that's where I'm going to stop. You do have a film that you need to watch on the KKK, so I'm going to leave you to that.